The station had been quiet all night. That was the first sign that something was wrong. Verdant Spire was never truly quiet. It was a large Galactic Union research station, orbiting the planet Cathera, and it hummed at all hours with the sound of machinery, with the low vibrations of the oxygen systems, with the distant clanking of maintenance bots moving through the lower decks. People walked the corridors at every hour. Scientists checked their equipment in the early morning. Engineers ran tests at midnight. The station breathed like a living thing, and that breathing never stopped. So when Elder Virith woke before dawn and heard nothing from the hatchery chamber next door, she did not go back to sleep. She lay still for a moment, listening. The hatchery was always warm and always noisy. 6 hatchlings, barely 4 days old, made a constant soft sound, a mix between chirping and purring, that could be heard through the thick walls of the station. It was a sound the Dracovan called Vethmuron, the first singing. Hatchlings made it without knowing they were making it. It was the sound of new life figuring out that it was alive. Virith heard nothing. She rose slowly. She was old, even by Dracovan standards, and her silver scales had begun to go pale at the edges. Her movements were careful and deliberate. She wrapped herself in the long cloth the Dracovan wore inside the station. They found the air aboard cold and thin, and she crossed to the hatchery door and opened it. The room was empty. Not empty in the way a room looks when someone has stepped out for a moment. Empty in the way that makes the chest go tight and the breath go short. The 6 nesting beds were still warm. The temperature lamps were still glowing. The soft moss that the hatchlings slept on was pressed down in 6 small shapes, the way moss stays pressed after a body has been lying on it. But there were no bodies. There were no hatchlings. There was nothing but the warmth and the light and the shape of 6 small creatures that were no longer there. Virith stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she turned and walked quickly to the communication panel in the main corridor and pressed the alert signal 3 times, the Dracovan signal for emergency of the blood kind, which meant something had happened to family. Within minutes, the hatchery corridor was full of Dracovan. Nara arrived first, her dark green scales bright with panic, her eyes wide and searching. She was the hatchling's mother, young and still recovering from the laying, and she pushed past Virith into the empty room and made a sound that no translation device on the station could properly render. It was grief and fear together, raw and immediate. She pressed her hands into the warm moss where her children had been sleeping and held them there as if she could call them back through touch alone. The others came quickly after. High-Collar Orith, wrapped in his ceremonial cloth, arrived with 3 of the Clutch Council behind him. Ambassador Pyrrell, sharp-eyed and already calculating, appeared at the far end of the corridor with 2 of his attendants. The human crew members who lived near the hatchery corridor began to appear in their doorways, blinking sleep from their eyes, trying to understand what the noise was about. Commander Leon Harris arrived last. He was not a man who rushed. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a calm face that showed very little of what he was thinking, which many people found unsettling and which the Dracovan had, over time, come to find reassuring. He had been the Galactic Union's diplomatic liaison to the Dracovan for 2 years, and in that time he had learned that showing panic rarely helped anything. He stood at the door of the hatchery and looked in. He saw the empty beds and the warm moss and Nara kneeling in the center of the room with her hands pressed to the floor. He looked at Virith. "When did you last hear them?" he asked. "Before midnight," she said. "I checked at the 2nd hour and they were all sleeping." Leon nodded slowly. "Has anyone checked the security feed?" Nobody had. They had all come directly to the room. Leon turned to the nearest human crew member standing in a doorway, a young engineer named Pete Gallo, who was still holding a cup of coffee, and said quietly, "Pete, security room. Pull the hatchery feed from midnight to now. Don't talk to anyone on the way." Pete nodded and disappeared down the corridor. Ambassador Pyrrell stepped forward. He was taller than Virith and considerably less patient. His deep blue scales were perfectly arranged, the way Dracovan scales arranged themselves when their owner was preparing to say something formal and possibly hostile. "Commander Harris," he said. His voice coming through the translation device clipped to his collar with a sharp precision that made the device sound almost angry. "The hatchlings of the Cathera Clutch are missing from a station under human management. I trust you understand what this means." "I understand that 6 young animals are missing and that we need to find them," Leon said. His tone was even and quiet. I also understand that this station is very large and that whatever happened, it happened in the last few hours. They are most likely somewhere aboard. Most likely, Pyro repeated, and the way he said it made the two words sound like an accusation. Leon did not respond to that. He looked instead at Pete's empty doorway, calculating how long it would take to pull the feed, and then he looked back into the hatchery at Nara, who had not moved from the floor, and his face did something very small and very brief, something that might have been sadness if you were watching closely. Then Pete came back down the corridor at a half-run, and his face was strange. Not frightened. Something closer to confused and almost amused at the same time, which was a very specific kind of expression that Leon had learned to pay attention to. "Sir," Pete said, stopping beside him and lowering his voice. "You need to see this." He held out his data pad. Leon took it and watched the security footage. It was short. It showed the hatchery, lit in green night vision. It showed 6 small shapes sleeping in their beds. Then, one by one, they stirred. They lifted their heads. They turned in the same direction, all 6 of them, as if something had called to them. And then, slowly and with some difficulty, they began to move. They crawled off their beds, dropped to the floor, and moved in a single group toward the ventilation grate in the lower wall. One of them pushed the grate with its nose until it swung open. Leon watched it happen and felt something he could not quite name. Then all 6 of them went in, one after another, and the grate swung back into place behind them. He handed the pad back to Pete without a word. "They went in on their own," Pete said. "Nobody took them." "I can see that," Leon said. He was quiet for a moment. "Which direction does that ventilation shaft run?" Pete checked. "Toward the human residential corridor, sir. Deck 7. Leon looked at the empty hatchery one more time. Then he looked at Ambassador Pyro, who was watching him with sharp, hard eyes. "We will find them," Leon said simply. "Give me time." By the time the station's morning shift began, everyone aboard knew that the hatchlings were missing. That was the way things worked on a station. News moved faster than people did, squeezing through the walls the same way the ventilation shafts carried heat, quietly, without permission, and arriving somewhere before anyone expected it. The Dracovan search parties had divided the station into sections and were moving through each one with careful, silent discipline. They checked every room they were permitted to enter. They pressed their ears, or what passed for ears on a Dracovan, a flat ridge of cartilage behind the jaw, against walls and listened for the soft purring sound of hatchlings. They found nothing. Each team returned to the central corridor, reported nothing, and went out again. Ambassador Pyrrell had sent 2 formal messages to the Union Council by breakfast. Leon had read both of them. The first was a record of the incident. The second was a warning. It said, in the careful language that diplomats used when they meant something much plainer, that if the hatchlings were not found within 12 hours, the Dracovan delegation would be withdrawing from the station and recommending to the Kethera Council that negotiations with the Galactic Union be suspended indefinitely. Leon read the second message twice. Then he set it aside and went to find Dr. Carol Sutton. Carol was the station's chief xenobiologist. She was a small, quick-moving woman in her mid-40s with short gray hair and reading glasses that she wore pushed up on her forehead even when she was using them, which gave her a permanently startled look. She had been on the station longer than anyone, including Leon, and she knew more about the Dracovan than almost any human alive. She was also, at this particular moment, pulling up every file she had on Dracovan hatchling biology on her workstation screen, because she had heard about the missing hatchlings 40 minutes ago and had immediately started trying to figure out what could have happened. Leon knocked on her open door and leaned against the frame. "Tell me something useful," he said. Carol did not look up. She had 3 windows open on her screen and was reading all of them at the same time, her eyes moving fast. "Give me a minute," she said. He gave her 2. She pushed her glasses down onto her nose, read something very closely, and then leaned back in her chair. "Okay," she said. "Here is something interesting. Newborn Dracovan hatchlings, in their first week of life, have not yet bonded to a specific caregiver. They are in what the Dracovan call the open window. During this period, they are drawn to certain things instinctively: warmth, rhythmic sound, low-frequency vibration. In the wild, or in a traditional Dracovan household, the caregiver provides all 3, body heat, heartbeat, and the low hum of Dracovan speech. But here on the station, In the hatchery, they had warmth from the lamps but no heartbeat. No low sound. The lamps are steady, but they are silent. Leon was quiet for a moment. So they went looking for it. That is my working theory, Carol said. The ventilation system carries heat and sound throughout the station. A hatchling in the open window period would be able to detect a heartbeat through the walls if it was close enough, and through the ventilation shaft it would travel much further. They followed the signal. She paused. The question is whose signal? The shaft runs toward Deck 7, Leon said. Carol nodded. The human residential corridor. She pulled up a thermal map of the station on a second screen. It showed the station in cross-section, colored in gradients from blue to orange depending on temperature. The hatchery was a warm orange. Most of the station was cool blue. But on Deck 7, there was a single concentrated point of deep orange, brighter than anything else on the map except the hatchery itself. What is that? Leon asked. That is someone running an infrared heat lamp in their quarters, Carol said. Which is not unusual. A lot of the crew have aches and joint problems. The heat lamps are standard medical equipment. She zoomed in on the orange point. It is located in Crew Quarters 714. I checked the assignment log. That room belongs to Corporal Dean Whitaker. Leon looked at the screen. The orange point was warm and steady. Dean Whitaker, he said, trying to place the name. Young. Night shift. Friendly face. He had spoken to him twice in the corridor, once about the water recycler on Deck 6 and once about something he could no longer remember. He works the overnight security rotation, Carol said, which means he sleeps during the day. He has been in his quarters since roughly 0300 hours. She paused. The hatchlings left the hatchery at approximately 0100, according to the security feed. They would have had 2 hours to travel through the ventilation system. Leon did the calculation in his head. The ventilation shaft from the hatchery to Deck 7 was not long. Hatchlings were small and the shafts were wide. 2 hours was more than enough time. Is there a camera in or near his quarters? He asked. Not inside, Carol said. There is one in the corridor outside. I pulled the feed. She opened a third window. It showed the corridor outside room 714. It was still and empty. The door had not opened since 0240, when it had closed behind Dean Whitaker coming home from his shift. Nobody has gone in or out since he returned, Carol said. But the hatchlings did not use the door, Leon said. No, Carol agreed. They used the ventilation grate, which is inside the room. They looked at each other. I need to know if they are in there before I go to Virith, Leon said. If I tell her I think I know where they are and I am wrong, it will be worse than not saying anything at all. I understand, Carol said. She pulled up the thermal map again and zoomed in. The orange point in room 714 was very warm. It was also, she realized as she looked more closely, slightly larger than it had been in the earlier reading she had taken an hour ago. She had not noticed it at the time. She noticed it now. Leon, she said slowly. I see it, he said. The heat signature in Dean Whitaker's room had grown. It was not the size of one person anymore. It was the size of one person and 6 small warm creatures curled on top of him. Carol let out a slow breath. Well, she said. That answers that question. Leon straightened up from the doorway. His expression had not changed much, but something in it had become quieter, more settled. Send a message to Pete. Tell him to meet me outside 714 in 10 minutes and to come quietly. He paused. And Carol, do not tell anyone else yet. Especially not Pyrrell. She nodded. What about Virith? He thought for a moment. I will contact her myself. After I see it with my own eyes. He walked out of the xenobiology lab and down the corridor toward the residential deck, and behind him Carol turned back to her screen and looked at the warm orange shape in room 714 for a long moment before closing the window. She was already looking forward to seeing how this turned out. Petty Officer Grace Allen was not having a complicated morning. She woke up, drank half a cup of coffee, pulled on her uniform, and walked down the corridor of Deck 7 toward the shared crew bathroom. She had 15 minutes before her shift began. She was thinking about the cargo manifest she needed to review and whether or not the recycler on the lower level was going to need another repair, and she was not thinking about anything unusual at all. She passed Dean's door and remembered that she had left her spare data pad in his room 2 nights ago when they had been playing cards with a few of the other crew. She knocked twice, their signal for nothing urgent, just checking, and when there was no answer, which she expected because Dean slept like something that had been sedated, she pressed her override code into the panel and opened the door. She had her hand raised to reach for the light switch on the wall when she stopped. The room was dim. The infrared lamp in the corner glowed a deep, dull red, the way it always did, filling the room with warmth that you felt before you saw. Dean was in his bunk, flat on his back, one arm thrown above his head, mouth slightly open, breathing in the long, slow way of someone who was deeply and completely asleep. And on his chest, arranged in a pile that somehow managed to be both tangled and deliberate at the same time, were 6 small dragon hatchlings. Grace did not move. She stood in the doorway with her hand still raised toward a light switch she was no longer going to touch and looked at the scene in front of her. They were beautiful. She had seen the hatchlings once before, through the window of the hatchery, but she had not been close to them. Up close, in the warm red glow of the lamp, their scales caught the light and scattered it in tiny directions, iridescent greens and deep blues and one that was almost copper-colored at the edges. Each one was roughly the size of a large cat, though proportioned differently, with longer necks and broader flat heads and small folded wings that were pressed down flat against their sides in sleep. Their claws, small, curved, surprisingly sharp-looking, rested on Dean's chest and stomach with a delicate precision, as if they had arranged themselves to be comfortable without puncturing anything important. 2 of them had their heads tucked under his chin. One had draped itself across his shoulder and was breathing against his neck. One was pressed flat against his sternum with its ear ridge directly over his heart. The last 2 were curled together on his stomach, their tails wrapped loosely around each other. All 6 were purring. The sound was low and continuous and strangely harmonic, the way several instruments playing the same note sound different from one instrument playing it alone. It filled the small room quietly, and it was, Grace realized after a moment, perfectly synchronized with the rise and fall of Dean's chest. Dean himself had not stirred. His expression was completely relaxed. He looked like a man who was having a very good dream. Grace lowered her hand from the light switch very slowly. Then she reached into her pocket with extreme care and took out her comm device and looked at it for a moment, thinking about who to message. She ruled out Pyrrol immediately. She ruled out the General Alert channel. She thought about Carol Sutton, then remembered that Leon Harris had been asking questions all morning, and she opened his contact. She typed, "Sir, I found them. Please come to room 714. Come alone. And come quietly." She sent it and then put her comm device back in her pocket and stood in the doorway and waited, because she was not going to move and she was not going to make a sound, and she was also, she realized, not going to be reviewing any cargo manifests this morning. Leon arrived in 4 minutes, which meant he had been close. He came down the corridor at a careful walk rather than a run, the way he always moved when he was being deliberate. He stopped beside Grace in the doorway and looked into the room. He did not say anything for a moment. He just looked. Then the corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the expression of a person who has been expecting something unexpected and is still surprised by it when it arrives. "Of course," he said, very quietly. It was barely a whisper. Grace glanced at him. "Of course what?" He shook his head slightly. "Nothing. Just thinking out loud." He looked at the hatchlings again. The one on Dean's chest had shifted slightly in its sleep, pressing its nose more firmly against the fabric of his shirt. "How long have you been here?" "About 5 minutes," Grace said. "He has not woken up. I do not think they would let him even if he tried." "They are in deep sleep," Leon said. "Carol told me they purr like that when they feel safe. It is their version of a sleep sound." He paused. "The one on his chest, that is the first bonding position. That is where a hatchling goes when it has chosen an anchor." Grace looked at the hatchling pressed over Dean's heart. "All 6 of them chose him?" "All 6 of them," Leon confirmed. She was quiet for a moment. Then, because she was someone who thought practically even in strange situations, she said, "What do we do now?" Leon took out his own comm device. He opened a private channel to Elder Viratha's personal frequency, not the general diplomatic line, not the official channel, but the direct one that Virath had given him 3 months ago after they had sat together through a very long and difficult negotiation and come out of it with something that worked. He typed carefully. He wrote, "The hatchlings are safe. All 6 of them. They are unharmed and sleeping. I need you to come to Deck 7, Room 714. Please come with High Caller Orth if he is available. Please do not bring the ambassador." He looked at what he had written. Then he added one more line. "He did not do anything to earn this. I want you to know that before you arrive. Whatever happened, it happened on its own." He sent the message and put the comm device away. Grace was still watching the hatchlings. The copper-scaled one on Dean's shoulder had shifted and was now pressing its small flat head against the side of his neck, its eyes still firmly closed, its tiny chest rising and falling in time with his. "He has no idea, does he?" she said. "No," Leon said. "He is going to wake up to quite a morning. Should we wake him now?" Leon looked at Dean's sleeping face and at the 6 creatures arranged on him with absolute trust and absolute ease, and he thought about it seriously for a moment. "No," he said. "Let him sleep. He has earned it, even if he does not know why yet." They stood in the doorway together and waited for the Elder to arrive, and the room stayed warm, and the purring went on. Elder Virath arrived at Deck 7 11 minutes after Leon sent the message. She came with High Caller Orth beside her and nobody else, which told Leon that she had read the message carefully and chosen to trust it. That was not a small thing. After the night the Dracovan had just been through, and after the formal accusations and the ultimatum that Pyrrol had issued, trust was not an easy thing to offer. Leon met them at the end of the corridor and walked beside them to the door of room 714. Grace had stepped back from the doorway to give space. The corridor was quiet. The morning shift had begun, and most of the crew were at their stations, so there was nobody to watch or wonder. Virath stopped at the door. She looked at Leon. "They are inside?" she asked. "All 6 of them," he said. "Sleeping. Unharmed." He paused. "I want to prepare you for what you will see. The door is open. You can look in from here before you go inside, if you prefer." She studied his face for a moment. Virath had very old eyes, pale gold, with the slight cloudiness that came with age in the Dracovan, and they were steady and searching. Then she stepped forward and looked through the doorway. She went very still. The Dracovan showed emotion differently from humans. They did not have the same range of facial movement. What they had instead were scales that reacted to strong feeling, shifting slightly, tightening or loosening at the edges, changing the way the light hit them. When Virath went still, her scales settled into a flat, even position that Leon had come to understand meant she was feeling something so large that she was holding herself quiet to contain it. Behind her, High Caller Orth stepped up and looked into the room. And he made a sound. It was not a loud sound. It was low and sharp and brief, the kind of sound that comes out of a person, or a Dracovan, when something they see is so far outside what they expected that the body reacts before the mind catches up. He brought both his hands up to his face, covering his jaw ridge, and stood there with his eyes on the scene in front of him. Dean was still asleep. The 6 hatchlings were still arranged on him in their same positions, still purring in their low synchronized harmony. The copper-scaled one had shifted again and was now sitting upright on his chest with its eyes half open, blinking slowly in the red glow of the lamp, looking at the 2 Dracovan elders standing in its doorway with an expression that could only be described as completely unbothered. It looked at Virath. Virath looked at it. Then it yawned, a wide, toothy, startlingly large yawn for such a small creature, and tucked its chin back down against Dean's collarbone and closed its eyes again. Virath exhaled. It was a long, slow breath, the kind that carries something heavy out with it. Orth lowered his hands from his face. He turned to Leon, and his voice when he spoke was very careful, the way a voice gets when the person speaking is choosing each word like they are picking up something fragile. "You understand what this is," he said. It was not a question. "Carol Sutton explained the open window period to me," Leon said. "The first bonding. She called it Vethsora." "Vethsora," Orth repeated. "The first warmth." "Yes." "It is the bonding that happens when a hatchling finds its anchor in the world, the first living thing it chooses to trust completely. In our history, It has always been a Dracovan elder. Always someone of the clutch, someone of the blood, someone known. He stopped. He looked back into the room. Never an outsider. Never another species. And never, in all the years our records go back, never all 6 from a single clutch choosing the same anchor at the same time. Leon was quiet. He had suspected this from what Carol had told him, but hearing it said plainly in the corridor outside Dean's door made it feel more solid and more strange at once. "What does it mean for them?" Leon asked. "For the hatchlings. Practically. It means he is their anchor," Orth said simply. "The one they will return to when they are uncertain. The one whose presence will settle them when nothing else does. The first warmth shapes the hatchling for life. It is not something that fades. It is not something that can be undone or transferred." He paused. "They will grow very large. And they will remember him when they are grown the same way they remember him now, as the first warmth. As the one who was there." Virith had not moved from the doorway. She was still looking into the room with those steady pale gold eyes. "What did he do?" she asked. Her voice was quiet. Not accusing. Genuinely asking. What did this human do to earn the first warmth of 6 hatchlings? Leon looked at the room. At Dean's sleeping face. At the infrared lamp glowing in the corner. He thought about Pete's security footage, about 6 small creatures lifting their heads in the dark and following something they could not see through the walls of the station. "Nothing," he said. He ran a heat lamp for his back pain. He came home from his night shift and went to sleep. That was all. Virith turned to look at him. There was something in her expression that he could not fully read. "He did not call them," she said. "No. He did not seek this. He did not even know they were gone," Leon said. "He has been asleep since 0300. Virith looked back into the room. The copper-scaled hatchling stirred again, raised its head, and opened one golden eye. It looked directly at Virith, looked at her with the flat, calm, unhurried gaze of a very young creature that has found exactly where it wants to be and has no interest in being anywhere else. Then it tucked its head back under Dean's chin. Virith was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and very certain. "Then he was chosen," she said. "Not courted. Not sought. Chosen." She paused. "There is a difference. A very large difference." Orth made a sound of agreement. He was already reaching into the folded cloth at his side for the small recording device the Dracovan high callers carried, the one used to capture events for the living archive, the oral history older than their written language. His hands were not entirely steady. "This will be recorded," he said, almost to himself. "This will be told." Leon stood in the corridor and looked at Dean Whittaker sleeping peacefully under 6 dragon hatchlings and thought that the universe had a very specific and very unhurried sense of what it found interesting. Then Virith turned to him, and for the first time since the night before, the tension in her old face had changed into something else entirely. "Commander Harris," she said, "thank you for sending for me. And thank you for asking me to come without Pyrrol." "I thought it was better that way," Leon said. She nodded once, slowly. "It was." Dean Whittaker woke up at 11:14 in the morning, which was later than he usually slept, and the first thing he noticed was that he could not move. Not in a painful way. Not in a frightening way. In the way of a person who has been pinned down by something warm and heavy and is only slowly becoming aware of just how much warm and heavy there is. He opened his eyes. The room was dim. The infrared lamp was on. His chest felt like someone had placed a heated blanket on it, except the heated blanket was breathing. He turned his head slightly and found himself looking at a small, iridescent, copper-scaled face approximately 4 inches from his own. The face had golden eyes. The golden eyes were open and looking directly at him. There was a brief moment of mutual stillness. Then Dean said, very quietly, "Are those on me?" Nobody answered, because Grace had stepped back into the corridor some time ago to give the Dracovan elder space, and Leon and Virith and Orth were standing just inside the doorway watching him with expressions that ranged from carefully neutral to barely contain something. Dean lifted his head very slowly and looked down at his own chest. 6 hatchlings, arranged on him in a variety of positions, all of them now awake and looking at him with calm, unblinking golden eyes. "How long have I been asleep?" he said. "Since approximately 0300, Leon said from the doorway. "It is now after 11. Dean looked at him. Then he looked at Elder Virith. Then at High Caller Orith, who was holding a recording device and watching him with an expression that was impossible to read. Then he looked back down at the 6 hatchlings. "Okay," he said slowly. "I am going to need someone to explain this to me." Leon explained it to him. Calmly and simply, the way Leon explained most things, without unnecessary words and without the kind of drama that would have made the situation worse. He told Dean about the hatchlings going missing. He told Dean about the ventilation shaft and the thermal map and the infrared lamp. He told Dean about the open window period and about Vethsora, the first warmth. He told Dean that 6 Dracovan hatchlings had traveled through the walls of the station in the dark to find the warmest and most rhythmic place they could detect, and that place had been his chest, and they had been sleeping on him for approximately 8 hours. Dean listened to all of this without interrupting. He was still lying flat because moving significantly was not an option. The hatchling on his sternum had not shifted. The 2 under his chin had pressed closer at the sound of his voice. When Leon finished, Dean was quiet for a moment. "And I did not wake up," he said. "You sleep like something that has been sedated," Grace said helpfully from the corridor. "So they picked me," Dean said. "Because of the lamp." "Because of the lamp, the heat, and your heartbeat," Leon said. "Carol believes the heartbeat was the primary signal. The lamp amplified it." Dean looked at the hatchling on his chest, the one lying flat with its ear ridge pressed directly over his heart, and something in his expression shifted. It was a small shift. The kind that happens when something unexpected turns out to be something you did not know you needed. "Okay," he said again. He said it differently this time. Ambassador Pyrrell arrived 11 minutes later, having been told by one of his attendants that the hatchlings had been found and that Virith and Orith were on Deck 7. He came into the corridor expecting disaster or at least a formal incident. He came into the doorway of room 714 and saw the situation and opened his mouth. Elder Virith said one word in Dracovan, short and flat and absolute, that the translation devices rendered simply as, "Enough." Pyrrell closed his mouth. Virith did not look at him. She was looking at Dean, who was now sitting up very carefully in his bunk with 6 hatchlings rearranging themselves around him in response to the change in his position. None of them had let go. 2 had climbed to his shoulders. 1 was sitting in his lap. The copper-scaled one had its front claws lightly gripped in the fabric of his shirt and was watching his face with an attention that was almost serious. "The Clutch Council will meet this afternoon," Virith said to the room. "The accusations against the human crew will be formally withdrawn. The station's management record in this matter will be noted as without fault." She paused. What happened here was not negligence. It was not failure. It was the hatchlings exercising the only judgment they have in the open window period, the judgment of need. They found what they needed. Orith stepped forward. He spoke to Dean directly, and his voice had taken on the particular resonance of the high callers when they were speaking something that would be remembered. "You are to be given the title of Ward Anchor of the Kethera Clutch. There is no human equivalent for this title. It means that you are guardian, first warmth, and chosen kin to these 6. They will grow large, and they will remember you, and in Dracovan law your bond with them is a matter of record from this day." Dean looked at Leon. Leon looked back at him with an expression that said, "Yes, this is real, and no, there is nothing to be done about it." "I have a night shift," Dean said. "We will arrange coverage," Leon said. The last thing that happened that morning was the quietest. Nara, the hatchling's mother, had come down the corridor while Pyrrell was being silenced by Virith. She had stayed outside the doorway and watched in silence. When the formal words had been spoken and Orith had put his recording device away and Pyrrell had gone back up the corridor looking like a man who had decided to lose gracefully, Nara came into the room. She did not speak. She looked at her 6 children, all alive, all well, all arranged around a sleeping human who was now sitting up and looking slightly overwhelmed, and she made a small sound that was private and not meant for anyone else. Then she crossed to Dean and stood in front of him. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she placed one hand on his chest, flat and warm, directly over his heart. She bowed her head. Dean did not move. He understood that something important was happening, even if he did not fully understand what. He sat still and let it happen. Nara lifted her head after a moment and stepped back. She did not say anything. She did not need to. That evening, Leon sat in the observation deck with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and looked out at the planet below. He wrote his official report on the incident. He described the hatchlings leaving the hatchery, the ventilation shaft, the thermal map, the discovery, and the formal resolution. He noted the withdrawal of all accusations and the title given to Corporal Dean Whitaker. He noted that 6 Dracovan hatchlings were currently residing in Crew Quarters 714, and that arrangements were being made. At the end, he added one last line. It said, "Recommended action, none." Sometimes the universe decides things on its own, and the best a liaison can do is stay out of the way. He looked at it for a moment. Then he sent the report and finished his cold coffee, and below him the planet Kethera turned slowly in the dark, and somewhere on Deck 7 a man named Dean Whitaker sat on the floor of his quarters with 6 young dragons asleep against him and tried to figure out how he was supposed to explain this to his mother.